Be'ezus Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zevachim, Daf Tesvav, number 15. And we will begin from Daf Yud Dalet Amud Beis, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines from the bottom. Iboy Lahu. We are discussing the service in the temple, which is called Halacha, as you can see in the picture. The Kohen. Hi, Lewis, we just began. We're discussing again halacha. Halacha is where after you shecht the animal, the kohen is mekabel the blood, as you see in his right hand with a vessel, and then he carries it towards the mizbeach and then gives a splash on the mizbeach. So the question over here is, suppose you line up a couple of kahanim. Now you see it has to be done with your feet. You're walking. What the Gemara's question is, what happens if you line up a couple of kahanim and you just pass the blood, you pass the vessel from one kohen to another? So basically, you're moving the blood from the place of the slaughtering to the place of to the mizbeach without ever using your feet. It's just the passing. So let's just give an example. Here's the picture. You can see them just passing the blood. It's unclear a little bit to the mizbeach. And so the question is where, and basically you, let's say, shechted by the north side of the mizbeach, a little, quite a distance from the mizbeach. You had to walk towards the mizbeach. So the question is, the Gemara's question is, here we go. Ibayilahu, 9 lines from the bottom, Yudal Beis. Ibayilahu, here's the question. Halacha shloi beregel. If someone does the movement of the blood without using his feet, just by passing it to somebody else, shema halacha, is that considered a movement? And therefore, if someone has a bad thought, he could passel the carbon. And of course, if it's considered a halacha, then the non-kohen is not allowed to participate. Or maybe lo shema halacha, that's not considered a halacha, and therefore a bad thought would not passel, and you have to redo it. You have to have a kohen physically take the blood in the vessel, walk it over to the mizbeach. Tashma, come in here. We learned in the Mishnah, we learned in a brisa quoted previously, v'chein yoshev, if you sit, v'chein b'smoil, or you carrying the blood with your left hand, pasel. Now, what's wrong with sitting? How do you get the blood? By sitting right next to where you caught the blood. So pashtus is you pass it over to somebody else. You're sitting, you're passing it over to somebody else. And every kohen is sitting until you get it over to the mizbeach. So that's wrong because everybody's sitting. But if all the kahanim were just lined up in a row and you're just passing it by hand, but they're all standing, kosher would be kosher. So we see that passing it is good enough. And says the Gemara, not so. Dilma Yoshev, the problem with Yoshev is sitting. He's actually moving. Let's say he has a chair, okay, with wheels on it. The Koshayef Meshav, he's just rolling towards the mizbeach. So that's the problem. But Oymid Dumi Yoshev, but a standing that's also moving. Deny it purta that he's moving a little bit. He's moving his feet. Even if he's passing it to somebody else. He's actually shuffling his feet a few inches. That's called a good movement, and that's called halacha. Tashma, come in here. Shochat. This was by Erev Pesach. They just needed to have a assembly line to get the shchitas of all the karbonos and get them splashed onto the mizbeach. Shochat Yisrael, a Yisrael did the shchita. The kibel kohen. And a kohen caught the blood. Nasan lechaveri, he gave it to his friend. V'chaveri lechaveri, they passed it along till they got it to the mizbeach, and one kohen splashed it on the mizbeach, and then they returned the empty vessel. So how did they do that? That's not halacha. You're supposed to walk the blood over to the mizbeach. And says the Gemara, Hasamname dinaidi purta. They actually walked a few steps. They didn't just take it from their person standing next to them. They took it and then walked 2 steps and gave it to somebody else. So they actually, each one did a mini halacha. What's the novelty of that? They're actually walking. If you do it with a lot of kahanim, it brings about a beautification of the king. As you're doing it, more kahanim are participating in this mitzvah of halacha dam haPesach. So kashma. So we still don't have an answer. Can I just not move and pass the blood to another kohen who passes it to another kohen to get it onto the mizbeach? Tashma, come in here. Kibel hakosher. If a kohen caught the blood, okay, he caught the blood as it was slaughtered, v'nasel apostle, and he gave it to, let's say, a non-kohen, and a non-kohen was standing next to me. He passed it to a non-kohen. Yachse lekosher. The non-kohen didn't do anything. He should return it back to the kosher. Why? Because if he takes it further, then it comes out that he is doing halacha and he's a non-kohen. So that's why we ask him, give it back to the first kohen. So we see from there that even if you don't move and you're just passing it along, that is called a halacha. Answers the Gemara, Ema, we have to say the opposite. Yachse hakosher v'ikabla. You return it back, not that you would give it to a back to the first kohen that you took it from, but you actually move it along. You can see from there that it is a good movement. Halacha is a good halacha because what the apostle does, the non-kohen just passes it along to the kohen that's nearest to the mizbeach. That's how you really learn it. So we're not clear. Halacha shloi beregel, without feet, not movement, getting the blood to move without people moving it by foot, is that a good movement? So itma, we finally concluded. Amar ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha shloi beregel. If you didn't move and you just carried it without moving your feet, lo yishma halacha. That's not considered a halacha. That's not considered a movement. Says the Gemara. The Gemara go to Amud Aleph. Okay, let's say you shechted right close to the mizbeach. Okay, let's say and you passed it to another kohen, who passed it to a third kohen, who's standing by the mizbeach. But you told me halacha shloi beregel. That's not a good halacha, and you have to do halacha. The Torah tells you that there are four main services: slaughtering the animal, catching the blood, and moving it towards the mizbeach. Well, if you didn't move it towards the mizbeach, you just got it to the mizbeach. So can you just send it back? It's already at the mizbeach. You're sending it back, and then have somebody walk it to the mizbeach. Can you fix what you did wrong? That's a question. Efshel l'sakuna or loy efshel l'sakuna. Can you fix what you did wrong, or you can't fix what you did wrong? Once you got the blood to the mizbeach the wrong way, that invalidates the whole carbon. Tashma, come in here. We can come in here. Kibel hakosher v'nasan l'apostle. If the kosher accepted it and he gave it to the apostle, so he did gave it to the apostle, so he did something wrong. He did a halacha that was invalid halacha because he gave it to a non-kohen, right? Yachse lekosher, then just give it back to the original kosher, to the original kohen, and he will walk it now back to the mizbeach. So you can see from there that you could, if you did something wrong with the halacha, you could just go back and fix it. So even if you learn that you pass it along to the kohen to put it on the mizbeach, not that you go backwards. If that's what you learn pshat, that's for sure good, because that teaches you that the halacha was a good halacha. So, but even if you learn that the halacha was not a good halacha, and yachzer means you give it back to the original kohen, we see that caught the blood, we see you could fix it if you did something wrong. So that's what the question is. If you learn that you can never fix it, then right away you invalidated the halacha by giving it to the puzzle. And the fact that the Brisa says you can return it back to the original kohen indicates that once you did something wrong with the halacha, you just go back and do it right. That's what the Gemara says. Answers the Gemara, not true. Only in that case you can do it right. Mi sabrit the koi zar gavai. Loy koizar the koizar begabai loy the koizar berai. What it means is, and maybe I have a picture over here. Here it is. There, the reason why you give it back to the kohen, because look at the picture over here, where the kohen that accepted it, that got the blood, he gave it to a non-kohen who was further away from the mizbeach. So that by giving it to the non-kohen who was further away from the mizbeach, there was no halacha done, no movement towards the mizbeach at all. So therefore, in this situation, we tell the non-kohen, give it back to the kohen, and then the kohen, walks it over to the mizbeach. Only then it works. But if the non-kohen was standing closer to the mizbeach, and the kohen gave it to the non-kohen who was closer to the mizbeach, so there was a movement towards the mizbeach, and now it was touched by a non-kohen who said you can repair that damage. There's no indication that you can repair that damage. That's what the Gemara is trying to say. It's talking about where the Zar Barai was further distancing from where the Mizbeach is. Itmar, we learned a teaching. If you move the blood to get to the Mizbeach without using your feet, Pesula, it's puzzle. And let's say you got the blood to the Mizbeach by just passing it along, impossible. Alma loy efshla tekune. Rabbi Yochanan made a fait accompli that there's no way to fix that problem. Once it got to the mizbeach, or once you made a movement without using your feet, so then it's impossible to go back and do it. The Gemara says, Esvei, let me ask you a question on that. Esvei Rav Nachman Ula. Rav Nachman asked the question of Ula, which is who Rabbi Yochanan said over in his name. We find nishbach min akli al haritzba va'asafai kosher. We have, let's see if I have it. Yeah, we have over here in our picture over here. Here's the mizbeach, right? The Brisa says that if a kohen caught the blood and spilled the blood on the floor, he spilled the blood on the floor. All he has to do is pick it up. He was carrying it in the vessel, and he tripped with the vessel, and the vessel fell on the floor, and the blood's on the floor. Just pick it up and bring it to the mizbeach. Wait a second. It moved a few inches towards the mizbeach without feet. And yet, what do you tell the kohen to do? Pick up the blood and then bring it to the mizbeach. So we see from there you could fix it. So that's what the question is. If the blood fell from the vessel onto the floor, vasafa, and the kohen picked it up, kosher, it's a kosher halacha. So we see that you could fix it when you do something wrong in halacha. And says the Gemara, that the blood did not go towards the mizbeach, it went in the other direction. So you didn't have the movement towards the mizbeach without your feet. It was actually moving in the other direction. He spilled it behind him. How's it possible when you spill something on the floor, it only goes backwards, not in front of you? And says the Gemara, that could happen, bimkoim midroin. If there was an incline in the floor, it will roll backwards, not towards the mizbeach. Or you can say that the base and the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, there was a guma. The guma was a little hole there, so it didn't move toward the blood fell into a hole right before the mizbeach, so it didn't move towards the mizbeach. Or if some of the blood congealed, so it blocked, there was no flow towards the mizbeach, so you didn't do anything. So basically, what the Gemara got through saying is that really, if you made any movement of the blood towards the mizbeach without using your feet, it's invalid and you can't repair it. The case with the blood is talking about the blood fell in the opposite direction, therefore you could pick it up. Says the Gemara, the Ichbel Tana Lashmini Kolhani, the Tana went out of its way to teach us such a remote place, remote situation where the blood fell backwards and all rolled backwards. Void, but the other parak says, if you didn't take it in if the one who caught the blood missed, the blood splurted directly on the floor. Nishbach al ritzba ba'asafa, you first fell on the floor, and then you brought it into the vessel. Puzzle, that's puzzle. So why did you say that's the case? Liflik b'dinei, you can make a differentiation of even if it spilled when it was already in the vessel. B'med devar mamurim kishyatzal chutz. When do we say that it's permitted to pick it up? If it fell backwards, away from the Mizbeach. If it goes towards the Mizbeach, pasul, because it made a movement without its foot, and you can't rectify that. To Yufta, that is a refutation against Ula, and that's the refutation, is that once you made a halacha shaloi beregel, you could go back and fix it up. If you make a mistake, go back and fix it up. Itmar, but the Gemara does not. I'm not satisfied yet. Itmar, we learned halacha shaloi beregel. If you move without your feet, machlokes Rab Shimon Rabbanim. That would be under the machlokes Rab Shimon Rabbanim. If you remember in our Mishnah, Rab Shimon said halacha, it's such an unnecessary part of the service, even though you have shchita, you have kabbalah, and zrika. Halacha, since you could technically shech very close to the mizbeach, as you can see, if you person shechs right over here, so then you don't even have to get halacha at all. So therefore, halacha technically could be not non-existent. So Rab Shimon held that halacha is not existent. So what was, and Rabbanan said it is. So the Gemara now wants to explain the machlokes between Rab Shimon and Rabbanan. B'halacha Rabasi, if you had a long walk from where you shechted to Kuliyama pligi de psula, everybody agrees, even Rab Shimon would agree, that a bad thought can passel it. So if you shechted it far away from the mizbeach, even Rab Shimon says, if you do halacha, it would passel it. Ki pligi b'halacha zutarte, when you had no place, you shechted very close to the mizbeach. And therefore, Rab Shimon says, because you accepted it so close to the Mizbeach, it's not a service, because it's not a halacha, it's a halacha shloi beregel, and therefore that's good. Halacha shloi beregel is still good. But Tanakama says, even halacha shloi beregel could be considered a halacha, and therefore, all you need to do is just pass it to one person to bring it to the mizbeach, that's considered to be a halacha, and you could passel it. That's considered an avoida, and you could passel with your bad thoughts. So what the Gemara is trying to say is that halacha shloi beregel, are you allowed to do it? Is it considered halacha? That would be considered the machlokes between Rab Shimon and Rabbanim. Rab Shimon will hold it's not, and Rabbanan still will hold halacha shloi beregel is considered a halacha. So if that's the interpretation, so according to Rab Shimon, when you do something very close to the mizbeach, it's not an avoida. So machila b'marava, so they laughed on this interpretation of Rab Shimon. El chatos ha'oif, the bird that's used as a chatos. When you shecht the bird, you don't shecht it, you knock its head off with the back of the nail. And what they did was, with these birds, let me just bring it up. Well, here we go. What they did was you see the kohen over here with the bird, he knocked its head off, and then you squeeze it and you get the blood to splash onto the mizbeach. That's how you do. You did the malika right there, and then you splash the blood on the mizbeach. So we know that if the kohen has a bad thought at that point, he passels the bird, he passels the chatas. Now, according to Rab Shimon, that any time you don't have a movement, if there's no movement needed, that's not called an avoida, because that's what we're understanding Rab Shimon. So then how could you passel this bird ever? If you made a bad thought before the blood came out, you didn't do anything. As soon as the blood started to splash out, well, as soon as it came out, before it even hit the wall, you already became the zrika. So where was the case that, according to Rab Shimon, you would have a possibility that a chatos oiv could be invalidated by a bad thought? That's the Gemara's question. Chatos oiv, the psula ba machshava, Rab Shimon, how's that possible? If you thought before the blood came out, lav klimhu, you didn't do anything. The ibasa denafik, and if after the blood came out, it's avdei mitzvah, so you did the mitzvah. But according to the Chachamim, even if you don't have to do a big movement, it's still considered an avoida. You could passel it. But according to Reb Shimon, if no movement is needed, it's just leaning over to the wall, and so then how is it possible to invalidate a chatas oif with a bad thought? So the Gemara says, "My kushya." What kind of question is that? Dilma mid the parish va'ademotin mizbeach. It's possible, according to Reb Shimon, to invalidate the bird. from the time that the blood comes out of the bird's neck until it hits the wall, if he has a bad thought during these 1 second, then it invalidates the chatos. It invalidates the bird, and that's how Rab Shimon is going to understand that. The whole boya minei Rab Yirmi Rab Zera hoya maza. A person was spraying the bird. Let's say he sprayed the bird. Before the blood hit the wall of the mizbeach, in that second, his hand was chopped off. Okay, until the blood touched the wall and the airspace of the mizbeach. Maho, what's the din? Is that a kosher zrika or not? V'amalei, and Rabbi Zera responded, psula. My tama v'hiza v'nosam be'inam. We need a spray. We need the spray to actually hit the wall. And therefore, as long as it didn't hit the wall, the spray was not good. And therefore, if the kohen became a balmun before the blood hit the wall, then because his hand got chopped off, then it's apostle. So we see from there, in that second, in that split second, that's when the service is done. And if the kohen had a bad thought during that moment, that's when Rabbi Shimon will hold that it invalidates the carbon. But the Gemara doesn't even like this understanding, Rab Shimon, because basically what you're saying is that the only machlokes between Rab Shimon and the Chachamim is if actually you shechted the carbon right on the edge of the mizbeach, where Rab Shimon says, okay, since you didn't need halacha, there is no halacha, and it's a halacha without feet. And according to Rabbi Chabanan, since you still have to move it with your hands, that's considered a halacha. But the Gemara says that's not true because the machlokes is even if they have to take a long walk. This is the laugh that Marava said. Would Rab Shimon not argue when you have to take a long walk? They're still arguing. Rab Shimon held his opinion even if there was a long walk, even if you shechted it far away from the mizbeach, and you had to walk it, still Rab Shimon says a bad thought would not invalidate the carbon. Why? Because you could technically avoid halacha at all. So since technically you could avoid halacha at all, even if you shechted a carbon that needed halacha, it's still not considered a service that would be invalidated by a bad thought. So therefore, they're arguing by that. So so how do you learn pshat? Ella, what's the machlokes? By lochas zutra, so if you had no walk, kuli alma loy pasa, that there is no psul. If you shecht it right close to the mizbeach, everybody holds halacha beregel is not a halacha. There was no halacha done, so that's fine. Ki pligi, when do they have an argument by halacha rabasi? If you had to take a long walk, where Rab Shimon said since you could have shechted it by the wall, so halacha is not necessary. And Rabbanan said, if you shechted it far away from the wall, you at the end of the day, you're doing a halacha, you're walking it. So therefore, if you think a bad thought at that time, it would validate the carbon. What the Gemara is concluding over here is halacha beregal. The Gemara seems to include that it is not considered a halacha. It's not considered a halacha. Is it necessary to do it? We'll see. Halacha bizar. Here the Gemara concludes. Halicha bizar ve'achzira kohen v'chazav elichai. Let's say the non-kohen brought it to the mizbeach, and then he returned it back to a kohen. He walked back to the kohen where the animal was, v'chazav elichai, and then the kohen did the halacha correctly. Pligi b'nei Reb Chia, Reb Yanai, chadam kosher v'chadam pasal. Mar Savar, one held that it's kosher efshalet tekune. If he did it wrong by a non-kohen carrying the blood, bring it back, and the kohen will carry the blood. Umar Sava, because you look at the last person that did it. Umar Sava loy efshalet tekune. You can't fix it. Once you did it wrong, it's forever wrong. Okay. So because you look at the first person that did it. Now, what happens in the opposite case? They took the blood, the kohen brought it to the mizbeach. And then he brought it back, and then a non-kohen brought it back to the mizbeach. So it depends. According to Kasha, because you always look at the first person that did it. At Livrei Maksha, if you always look at the last person that did it, so then it's puzzle, because the last person that brought it to the Mizbeach was a non-Kohen. the divrei apoisel, but according to the one that said pasul before, because you always look at the first person that did it, machsher. In this case, he would machsher because the first person that brought it to the wall was a kohen, although he brought it back and a non-kohen brought it. So Rava says, af l'divrei apoisel pasul. Even according to the opinion that said that it was pasul, in this case it would also be pasul. That means even if a kohen brought it to the mizbeach and then returned it, and a non-kohen brought it back to the mizbeach, so technically I should look at the first person that brought it to the mizbeach, and it was good. It was already done. Kamash malam, no, it's still pasul. Why? Because who brought it back the second time was a zar, and you still needed to bring it to the mizbeach. My tama, dartzorech, we go to Abed Beis, labtu, you still needed to bring it to the mizbeach. Now the Gemara concludes, Amalei Rav Yirmiyah Baravshi, Hachi Amar Rav Yirmiyah Medifti, Hatzarech Lamtuye, the fact that if you still needed to bring it to the Mizbeach, would that invalidate would that invalidate the halacha? That would be Machlokes Rab Lezer and Rabbanan. That's the Machlokes between Rab Lezer and Rab Lazar. The Tanam we learned in the Mishnah, and this should be the Tanam we learned in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Hamahalech b'mokim shotzar lahalech." Rabbi Eliezer was another opinion that's brought in the Mishnah that says, "Halacha." It depends. If you go in the right direction, then machshava peselis. Then machshava would passel you. Machshava ain't tzarich lahalech. But if you go in the wrong direction, ain't machshava peselis. Then machshava would not passel. V'amar Rava said, "Hakol moedin." Everybody would agree. Both Rab Chamim and Rab Laza, kiblei b'bechutz. If you makabel the blood away from the mizbeach, v'chnisa b'fnim, and you brought it towards the mizbeach, zehilach shetzarach lahalach. That's a good halacha because he's going to the direction of the mizbeach. Kiblei b'fnim, if you makabel it towards the mizbeach, v'yitzin lechutz, and then you went and walked away from the mizbeach. Even the Chachamim would agree that's not a halacha because you're going away from the mizbeach. They're only arguing you actually brought it towards the mizbeach. It was already brought to the mizbeach. The chazer, and then you brought it away from the mizbeach. Now you have to bring it back. Marsava, the Tanakama holds hatzarach lamtui. You still have to bring it back. So therefore, you have to make another halacha, halacha round two. Umarsa Reb Lezer said, that's not considered a hilach because you already did one already. And the fact that you brought it back, now you have to bring it again, that's an unnecessary halacha. And that's what Reb Lezer holds. Abai said that can't be the machlokes because we learned Reb Lezer oimer hahalach b'mokum shetzarich lahalich machshava peselis. Machshava would argue ketzad kibul b'chutz v'nislefnim zeh hilach shetzarich lahalich, and Reb Lezer said kibli b'fnim. If you accepted it on the inside, and you walked outside, then you walked in a direction you didn't have to go. But Rab Lezer seems to imply, if you walked again, it means you accepted the blood towards the Mizbeach, then you walked away from the Mizbeach, and then you brought it back to the Mizbeach, even Rab Lezer seems to agree, and maybe he's explaining the Chachamim, that's called a halacha because he did it twice. Amalei, Itanya, right. Everybody agrees that this would be a problem. Getting back to our story, and let's end. If a kohen accepted blood and then brought it towards the mizbeach, right, and then he brought it back to where the animal was slaughtered, and a non-kohen brought it back to the mizbeach, so there Rava said, since even though it's an unnecessary halacha, because you went backwards and then you're bringing it back a second time, but still it would invalidate the carbon if a non-kohen brought it back towards the mizbeach for the second time, because at the end of the day you can't sprinkle when you're far away from the mizbeach. So when the non-kohen brought it back to the mizbeach, he invalidated the whole carbon. We originally thought that Reb Lezer would disagree with this idea, but it turned out that Reb Lezer would not disagree with this idea, and it's called a halacha, and it could be invalidated with a non-kohen doing it. Hadron Allah, Kol Azvachim will start, Mitzvah Hashem, maybe tomorrow, the next parak.